Hello and welcome to our interview with Air Alliance Houston. Today we'll be speaking with two individuals who are passionate about improving air quality in the Houston area. Joining us are Harrison and Alondra from Air Alliance Houston. We'll be discussing the main causes of air pollution in the Houston area, the organizations responsible for monitoring air quality, and what Air Alliance Houston is doing to help improve air quality. Air pollution is a serious issue that affects the health and well-being of everyone in our community. So let's get started to learn more about what we can do to make a difference. But before we begin, let me make a statement here to qualify that all statements today are of my opinion and my opinion alone. They do not represent my employer or Dexter McCoy as role as Commissioner of Fort Bend County. With that out of the way, welcome Harrison and Alondra.
Thank you for having us today. Appreciate that.
Well, the first question I have for you guys today is, can you describe the purpose of Air Alliance Houston?
Sure, I could take that one. And I'll introduce myself. I'm Harrison Humphreys. I'm Air Alliance Houston's Climate Programs Manager. I've been with Air Alliance Houston for four and a half years. The purpose of our organization, Air Alliance Houston. So we are a nonprofit advocacy organization that has been working to reduce the public health impacts of air pollution since the late 1980s. And our organization has gone through a few different iterations of existence. But through research, education, and advocacy, we hold polluters accountable, raise awareness across the greater Houston area about the impact of air quality on health, work for stronger protections against air pollution at the local, state, and national levels, and support environmental justice communities to be advocates for their own health. And we believe that everyone has a right to breathe clean air, and that where you live, work, learn, and play should not determine your health.
And Alondra, could you take a moment and tell us why air quality is so important to us?
Yes. So breathing is a necessity, and clean air is a basic human right, of course. So when it comes to living in Houston, it's one of the largest cities in the nation, and it's a city with several recent rankings of being in the top 10 dirtiest cities to live in the nation. And that's due to air quality. So breathing clean air becomes a privilege rather than a right at that point. It is a matter of life or death. We need to breathe to live. So within Houston, there's a disparity of 23 and a half years between Houston neighborhoods and the average number of years a person can expect to live. So these differences are closely aligned with cancer risk from air toxics and the air quality.
Oh, wow. All right, what are the causes of air pollution then? And specifically, why is our air quality so poor here on the Gulf Coast?
So I can take the first question, and I'd like to start by sharing a story of when I started working with Air Alliance Houston. On my first week working as a climate justice coordinator, I attended a public hearing with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and Union Pacific was requesting a permit in the Fifth Ward area. And there were families there were concerned, parents, concerned residents, and there were even children sleeping on the laps of those parents. And the meeting went on to past 11 p.m. So that was like a really, rude awakening to the situation, like my first week on the job. And at some point there were people back to back going up and, saying that they oppose a permit because they were going to a friend's funeral, going to a family member's funeral due to the air pollution that caused their premature death. And it was back to back. And not a few weeks later, I had the same experience at Fulshire High School with our construction was requesting a permit to build a concrete batch plant in Fort Bend County. So seeing, my time at Air Alliance Houston and seeing these events back to back still occurring after, we've done the work to advocate with TCEQ is really telling. And of course, like cancer is one of the long-term effects of being exposed to air pollution, and short-term effects include eye and throat irritation, shortness of breath, headaches, dizziness, nausea, even in healthy individuals. So these are things that people deal with on a day-to-day basis. Long-term effects, like I've mentioned, cancer, reduced lung development in children, higher rates of asthma, bronchitis, heart disease, and even early death. And our most vulnerable groups are people who live, work, or attend school near industrial operations, people with heart or lung disease, children whose lungs are still developing. And this is more present with people who are physically active. Of course, like no one should be punished for engaging in physical activity. And that's more generally, in Fort Bend County specifically, heart and lung disease are among the leading causes of death, and pollution has been proven to be a contributor in these deaths, specifically with WA Parish, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There are specific statistics on that. And more older adults in Fort Bend have heart disease than in the state as a whole.
Yeah,
Wow.
and just to, build off that and to talk about some of the sources, Alondra mentioned one very specific issue that the Houston area has, which is our very close proximity to some of the heaviest sources of pollution. And Houston, our primary sort of categories of sources are industrial pollution that comes from industrial sources, chemical refineries, petrochemical plants, that sort of infrastructure. Then there's mobile sources, so any sort of pollution that comes from cars, trucks, vehicles on the road, drayage equipment and ships in the port, anything that comes from something that's moving. And then there's other area sources, but a big issue here in Houston and in Fort Bend is the close proximity to these sources. Houston is somewhat infamous for having no zoning, which isn't exactly accurate, but it does result in situations where you have a concrete batch plant that's right next to a school, that's right next to a park, that's right next to people's homes. And so air quality is particularly bad in Houston from our numerous sources, and we're typically closer to these sources than other cities.
And I would assume that Fort Bend County, in proximity to the industrial complex along the Gulf Coast, is susceptible as well.
Yes, for sure. Our entire region, which they sort of call the Houston, Galveston, Brazoria region, that's the federal designation, has pretty bad air quality issues.
Specifically in Fort Bend County, can you guys talk a little bit more about WA Parish, which is our natural gas and coal power generation plant?
Sure.
Yes, so the WA Parish coal plant is located in Fort Bend County, and it is owned by NRG Energy, and it is one of the dirtiest facilities in the nation. It's the second highest emitter of sulfur dioxide and PM2.5 particulate matter in the state. And what we've seen the community in Fort Bend has been in this fight against industry, and specifically WA Parish, for decades. And Parish opened for operations in 1977. So it literally has been for decades. And this facility is very old. And these efforts have built momentum over time due to Parish's lack of reliability and the obvious health hazards it poses in the community. So for some context, Parish is capable of producing 3.8 gigawatts of power, or nearly 5% of all electricity feeding the entire ERCOT grid. And this exacerbates the impact of Parish's consistent failures. And at least one or more of Parish's units were off-grid during key moments and disasters, including Winter Storm Uri, Hurricane Harvey, and the 2022 record-breaking heat. In addition, there doesn't have to be a disaster for Parish to be underwater and harming the community. So in May 2022, there was a fire at Coal Unit 8. And in September of 2022, there was a chemical exposure that affected 100 employees and hospitalized 6. And Parish is responsible for upwards of 178 premature deaths a year, which that statistic comes from a Rice study by Daniel Cohan. And those are ozone and PM2.5 related deaths. It was 1 death related to ozone and 177 to particulate matter. There are also, beyond the environmental and health impacts, there are also concerns that Parish is a poor investment, which is completely relevant today because of, Petronova being brought back. But coal is not profitable. $1 billion went into Petronova only for it to fail 3 years later. And now, like I mentioned, it's being brought back and is said to be in operation by June. The $1 billion invested in Petronova could have funded the installation of 742 megawatts of solar, and that's being done in Sunnyside on a much smaller scale. So it's totally possible and something that we could look into as an alternative. Is there
Thank you.
Harrison?
Nothing to add.
So clearly, our air quality is at risk, is a risk for us here in Fort Bend County. With all of that being said, who's responsible for monitoring our air quality here in Texas, and how are they doing?
Yeah, I could take that one. So there's different levels of authority, and it is sort of a complex situation. As with any sort of situation where the federal, state, and local entities are kind of working together to regulate any sort of issue. But for air quality specifically, we can start from the top and work down from there. So arguably the primary, entity that's responsible for monitoring and controlling air pollution is the federal government and the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. They oversee and implement the Clean Air Act, which sets air pollution standards and all the various ways that we're supposed to be mitigating air pollution and containing it. States do a level of their own monitoring and enforcement in coordination with the EPA, and oftentimes states will have their own specific air quality laws and statutes. And in Texas specifically, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, does monitoring and enforcement. Some localities like Harris County and the city of Houston even also have pollution control departments, but that's not Houston is a big city. Harris County is a big county. I think that's more of an exception than the rule, but they also, do a lot of work around containing the impacts of pollution on public health. So EPA all the way up at the top, going down to the state level, there's TCEQ. And then city of Houston does have a pollution control department.
And how are they doing in this regard?
That is a tough question to answer in Texas because I'd say at least in Texas, TCEQ is not doing a very good job. Definitely not a comprehensive job in protecting the public from air quality. Just in the past 5 years, according to their own data, TCEQ has only held facilities accountable for 3% of the violations that have occurred in the past 5 years. And one of the primary issues with TCEQ historically is that they've refused to go after the worst actors. Instead they end up focusing on really minor offenders. And this is due to their direct friendliness with industry, and there is an issue with TCEQ is consistently understaffed and under-resourced by the state government, but even if they did have adequate resources, their entire disposition to industry is really friendly, and at least leadership has directed them to focus on letting industry do what they will for the supposed economic benefits instead of enforcing, air quality standards.
Well, if they aren't doing such a great job in monitoring our air quality, how do we know if we have enough information to tell if our air quality is poor or good? How is our air quality?
Oh yeah, I can take that one too. And so the answer is we really do not have nearly enough information, but for the information we do have indicates that our air quality is really bad. The Houston, Galveston, Brazoria region just got redesignated to severe non-attainment, which is that's a more severe indication than what it was at before, which I believe was serious non-attainment. So we've been downgraded for our poor air quality. And the issue of even understanding what our air quality is like is a problem in itself, because our air monitoring network is incredibly insufficient. Houston is a huge area, and the source of a huge amount of pollution, and there's not nearly enough regulatory air monitors that cover the physical area of Houston to understand what's coming in. And unfortunately, Fort Bend is even worse off. I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, but I don't think Fort Bend has a single regulatory air monitor within their county area. And there is, Airlines Houston has helped stand up a sort of informal, non-regulatory air monitor network to understand things like PM 2.5 levels in the area. But both those informal networks, but particularly the regulatory networks, are far insufficient to cover Fort Bend's air quality.
Alondra, can you expand on that a little bit and say how we can improve our air quality monitoring?
Yes, so there are groups like Airlines Houston and Fort Bend Houston Environmental, which is led by Donna Thomas and Veronica Pena, and they are residents in Fort Bend County. There are groups like that who are, like Harrison said, looking to place informal networks, informal air quality networks. So it really comes down to community outreach and finding, Airlines has this great air ambassador program where people volunteer in the neighborhood to have an air monitor in their home. So that's something that we're looking to expand into with the WA Parish campaign, finding those people who want to have that information, and take matters into their own hands as well.
So I think we've addressed that there is a problem going on here. In your opinion, guys, does the public know about this problem? Are they well aware that their air quality is such an issue for them?
So I can take that question, and I would like to reiterate what Harrison has said already, that we know that in Texas, the odds are historically stacked against the community when it comes to industry permitting. TCEQ consistently fails to adequately notify community and involve them in the permitting process as well as non-compliance processes. Parish has had several violations with air quality and groundwater alike, yet TCEQ has not publicized that or addressed it or reached out to the community. So there's always more community outreach that can and needs to be done on TCEQ's behalf, as well as the EPA. But we have organized several canvassing efforts to rally community and raise awareness, specifically on Parish. And from the data that we've collected, most people are not aware of Parish, and several of the coalitions that we work with and other organizations consider Parish to be NRG's best kept secret. So based off of the health implications, I think people can, have made that connection that that their health is deteriorating throughout the years because of this continued exposure to industry, but it has not been with the guidance of agencies like TCEQ.
You had mentioned some education courses that you guys are pushing into the communities to make people aware of, for instance, WA Parish. Are there any other activities that Airlines Houston is undertaking to make that knowledge more accessible to the public?
So specifically thinking about like air quality in Fort Bend or education around WA Parish.
Well, Airlines has a lot of work put towards their research, right? You guys have a vast knowledge set of how communities are impacted by it, where pollution is kind of spreading. Can you speak a little bit more about how Airlines Houston is developing an education and research focus?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's important to kind of just lay out that how we sort of go about developing our campaigns and our focus areas is, we do a lot of community engagement, and then we do a lot of research, and those two elements kind of combine to form like our policy focus areas. And a lot of times then our education components come out of those specific campaigns that we're working on. So for instance, with Fort Bend, we've identified that WA Parish is a huge problem, and that is I think a good vehicle to talk about things like air pollution. And so we really tried to, I wouldn't say that we necessarily have a general education campaign where, we're kind of just focusing on getting basic air quality impacts out there like that. It is much more tailored to, the specific issues. So with, WA Parish, we want to do education around why this specific plant is an issue, but also how it contributes to the overall environment of air quality issues in Fort Bend and in our region in general. So that being said, we do a lot of that with Fort Bend, the Fort Bend and WA Parish context. There's a lot to talk about with general air quality issues. But then, we look into some of our other campaigns, like we've worked a lot on transportation issues and specifically the issues around the I-45 expansion in Houston. And that has been, focused a lot more on the air quality impacts on trying to educate communities about the air quality impacts from mobile emissions and how living near a freeway is much more costly to public health than if you were able to live farther away. And we discussed those in connection with this very specific project that's still in contention. But then, there's also a climate change component to that too. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but we do try to tailor our education to the specific campaigns that we're working on.
Yeah, and I also want to add that a big part of public education is making information from TCEQ and making these overall processes more accessible to communities. So a big way that we're doing that is with addressing environmental justice across the region. So we have our environmental justice lab, and we're doing a lot of work with language access to make this information more accessible to people whose first language or primary language is not English. And in Fort Bend County, it's a really large and diverse county with several different languages. So we're working with English speakers, Spanish speakers, Vietnamese speakers, and it advocating for those groups within the county as well. The more we move into WA Parish work.
Thanks for those examples about how your community message is getting out there. What would your message be to an elected official?
Good question. Yeah, I can try to answer that first. So I guess be a couple messages there. The first one would be the air quality is an enormous issue in our region, and it has devastating effects on public health. And these impacts are cumulative and they happen over time, so they often go unnoticed. But our most vulnerable communities suffer from these impacts constantly. And I think it's very unfortunate that in Houston and in Texas, in many ways, we've ridden off those impacts, those public health disturbances, those premature deaths from issues of air quality as byproducts of the economic engine that we have going in Texas. And that's just something that comes with industry, and it doesn't really have to be that way. And there's a lot of suffering that we can mitigate if we really focused on air quality and the impact it has on our region. But then I think it's also important to look at climate change. According to the IPCC report that came out a couple weeks ago, we have very, very little time and very little opportunity to keep things from getting really, really bad. And climate change is almost an even more sort of intangible at the real issue than air quality, because not only is it invisible, but its impacts are supposed to be years from now. But we are feeling those impacts now through storms like Hurricane Harvey, through just the massively fluctuating inclement weather that we have throughout the past couple of years, and that's something that we need to work on now. The best time to work on it was yesterday, and we really need to get focused on it now.
Alondra?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Harrison said, and I think self-regulation within industry has been normalized throughout Houston's history. And I think that's why you don't see candidates, elected officials, counties have a platform, have an environmental platform, or even initiate those conversations with their community and their constituency. And I think that Houston and Fort Bend County specifically has the opportunity to change that self-regulation that we've normalized, because it's pretty clear that industry will always, continue to put profit over people. And like Harrison said, it's getting to be a little too late. And we've worked pretty extensively with the city of Houston to come up with a climate action plan. It would be wonderful if we could open that door for Fort Bend County to do the same.
That's a great example of something we can do to coordinate between Air Alliance Houston and the county. What other ideas might you have to better align the county's goals with that of Air Alliance Houston?
So, I mean, we would love to obviously work with the county on WA Parish and whatever mitigating those impacts looks like. I think we're open to discussing. But there's all kinds of different issues. Climate change, which just mentioned. Fort Bend County holds 2 seats on the Houston Galveston Area Council's Transportation Policy Council. That was a lot of acronyms. HJC's TPC. They and this body, makes humongous funding decisions for how transportation gets planned and funded in our region and which projects go forward, like the one I mentioned, the I-45 expansion, but also the Grand Parkway and any highway expansion or other transportation project that is using federal dollars goes to this committee. And Judge KP George and Commissioner Grady Prestige both have seats on this committee. And they could play active roles within shaping transportation policy and air quality emissions from transportation in a big way. So that's another one. Advocating for increased regulatory monitor coverage. Like we mentioned, I don't think that there is a regulatory monitor in Fort Bend, and that's something that the county government can work with EPA to say, hey, we really need a better sense of what our air quality looks like in our county. I think that'd be another point of cooperation, coordination. There's probably a number of different ones.
Well, while you think about more of them, I'll let Alondra elaborate on any she has in mind as well.
I'm thinking specifically also how the county can work with the different school boards that exist in Fort Bend County. So there's several different upcoming school board elections, and so many changes that can be made within the school district, like electric school buses and the HVAC system in schools. And specifically with Parish, there are over 15 schools in proximity to the plant. The nearest one is just like 10 minutes away. So there are definitely a lot of ways that we can work with the county, and also we can work in relationships with other different agencies.
Well, those are the questions I had for today, but I did want to give you guys a final word. But before we say that, I do want to have some concluding remarks. But like I said, I want to give you guys the final word and any final thoughts that you might have of what we spoke about today.
I don't have anything anything else to add. Just appreciate that the county is interested in air quality and environmental impacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also would like to add that I appreciate that the county's interested. Like I mentioned already, there's a lack for these conversations about the environment and environmental platforms overall. And I would like to see that change and be a part of that with this specific county. So looking forward to that.
Well, that concludes our interview with Harrison and Alondra from Air Alliance Houston. We want to thank them for taking the time to speak with us today and for their important work in advocating for clean air in the Houston area. We have learned air pollution is a complex issue with many sources, but it's clear that individuals, organizations, and policymakers all have a role to play in reducing emissions and improving air quality. We encourage everyone to stay informed and get involved in efforts to promote clean air and a healthier environment for all. Thank you again to Harrison and Alondra for your passionate work towards environmental action. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.